Hi, this is Soul Mechanics, practical tune-ups to be a healthy human, and I'm your host, Kate Foley. Nothing strikes as fast or as hard as grief. Grief is merciless and indiscriminate. If you live long enough, you'll experience grief at least once in your life. Grief is completely natural, and yet feels as foreign as a cold, dark, lifeless planet. Grief typically teaches us through experience. You can't read about grief and become acquainted. It's not something that our parents teach us, like death. Death and grief are similar, yet drastically different. To understand the concept of finality isn't the same as breathing, walking forward, and making decisions while being ripped apart. Grief is something that's felt with the entire body. If you've ever lost someone or something that has truly rattled your soul, you know it's not rational nor controllable. It comes when it damn well pleases, and usually at really inconvenient times. There aren't any alarms or red flags warning you about the enormous wave approaching at light speed. But the wave hits and takes you to a barren island. Everything changes in an instant. This can happen for years. And I'll say it again, it's a completely natural process. There are expected deaths, unexpected deaths, physical losses, symbolic losses. There are deaths of potentials and deaths of hopes and dreams. Entire families are wiped out. Houses are burnt down. Storms, fires, and governments can sweep thousands of lives away in one evening. There's loss of innocence, loss of the self, loss of time, displacement, murders, suicides. There's grieving something you thought you didn't want, like an abortion or an idea. These are all part of being human, but again, painful, devastating, dark, uncertain, and foreign. Often words can't describe the pain that someone experiences in acute grief. The life we once knew is gone in a flash. In the book On Death and Dying, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was the first to explain the 5 stages of grief, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. She explains that although these stages are very much experienced, they are not linear. These emotional states can appear, move on, come back, stay for a while, and then move on again. Sometimes a person might remain in denial for months, and then move into acceptance. Some people might be depressed for years and suddenly move into anger. Emotions can be evasive and simultaneous. Did you know that you can experience 5 emotions at one time, and they can all be in conflict with one another? It's a real crowd pleaser, but, again, completely normal. Something I hear a lot and have experienced myself is, I didn't know I was grieving until someone pointed it out. When my grandmother, my person, died, I pushed my uncomfortable sadness deep into my stomach. One day, about a year later, I was walking through my neighborhood, and I was passing an arborvitae I'd passed 100 times. There was something about the way that the sun hit that shrub, and then a small propeller airplane flew overhead. It reminded me of summers spent in my grandmother's house. Her laughter and warmth hit me all at once. I doubled over and began sobbing uncontrollably. I barely made it to the front door of my house before I collapsed onto a chair crying. My husband at the time had no idea what was happening. I didn't know what was happening. I called a very dear friend and asked for her insights. She said immediately, "Kate, you never grieved your grandmother. You're grieving." When she said this to me, I took a deep breath and sighed, and I said, "Yeah, I'm grieving." And then I started laughing, because I was a grief counselor, and I had no idea I was grieving. Our bodies exhibit signs of grief. The body always knows. The body's expression of grief is varied and can be very confusing. Many people visit their doctor more frequently following a major loss. Although it is prudent to closely monitor your health during an acute grief episode, it's important to be aware that there are going to be odd bodily expressions that are masked as a health concern. Here are just a few examples of your body's expression of grief. Excessive tears. fatigue, moodiness, inability to focus, agitation, fogginess, lack of desire, frequent sickness, loss of appetite, overeating, temperature variations, panic attacks, alcohol cravings, isolation, noise and light sensitivity, headaches, muscle aches, frequent injuries, electrolyte imbalances, dehydration, hair loss, visual disturbances, audible disturbances. These are all signs of grief, and there are many, many more. It is so important to have a supportive group of friends or family around, but there is a caveat here. What do I mean by supportive? I mean people who will meet you where you are, wherever you are. So a huge pet peeve of mine is when I hear one person saying to a grieving person, "You need to move on with your life. It's been 6 months." Oh no. There are no hard and fast rules to grieving. When I was a grief counselor, I learned that it is common for the year anniversary of a major loss to return the acuteness of the loss all over again. Time has no relevance with grief. In fact, sometimes time feels cruel because people feel like they're losing touch with their loved one with each passing day. It's terrifying to think that you can't remember their face anymore, or the memories begin to fade. Many people get to the 2, 3, or 4-year anniversary and search for anything that reminds them of their own grief, because the memories are fading and their own painful feelings bring back the connection. Expect tidal waves. Grief will arrive unannounced and drown you. You will be thrown to the bottom of the ocean and choked. Then you'll be thrust up to the crest of the wave, gasp for air, and get thrown back down again. Suddenly, just when you think you're about to die, you've been placed delicately on the beach with a blanket and a margarita. There is no predictability to grief, and there is no control. You must oblige the process. When you hear people say everyone grieves differently, they do. So please don't judge someone when they cannot sit at their parents' bedside day after day watching them wither away. Some people are not ready to experience it, and you know what? That's okay. You cannot force someone to do and to be someone who they aren't. Yes, it might seem insensitive or callous to choose not to be at the bedside of your beloved, but we don't know what each person experiences and how they experience it, so don't judge. None of us do life well. We're all just doing the best we can. And on the subject of not doing life well, oh dear God, the platitudes are endless. Time heals, it gets better, you'll get over this, everything happens for a reason. Actually, no, those aren't really true. If you've lost someone like a spouse, a child, a beloved parent, a sibling, a best friend, a dog, a cat, anything or anyone you've become a part of, you are changed forever. Your world has been shattered. Those platitudes are not relevant. Time doesn't heal something that has been demolished into tiny little particles. It doesn't get better. No one gets over losing a limb. Everything might happen for a reason, but if you can't tell me a legitimate reason, then I don't want to hear it. People often say these things with good intentions, but most people who use platitudes aren't putting themselves in your shoes. When you are acutely grieving, you're feeling everything because the pain is so intense. And honestly, no one can understand your grief. No one. Because no one had your relationship. I think that's why grief is so isolating. We all carry different personalities, coping styles, and experiences that shape us. So no one's grief looks the same. Your relationships will change. In our culture, death is something to avoid. Just take a look at our obsession with youthful appearances. It's a blaring sign. A grieving person will likely get flooded with support for the first month, maybe 2. Then everyone disappears. Some of your best friends will disappear. Some might surprise you and reach out regularly. Some might surprise you with their insensitivity and ignorance. Something I've always found interesting was how much a deeply grieving person has to forgive the ignorant statements coming from people around them. It seems to be a part of the process. But I think another piece of the pain of grief is experiencing the loss of friendships. People who you thought would surely be supportive aren't, or they disappear. This is like being kicked in the stomach after being pushed off a cliff. But I can assure you that there are friends who will surprise you in really beautiful ways, or strangers show up to show support and often become cherished friends. Don't underestimate the power of shared experience. I also think that bereavement groups can be incredibly helpful because of that reason. It's normal to feel the presence of your loved one after they die. It's normal to dream about them. I personally think that they do visit us. I think they hang around for a bit, maybe forever. I think there's a detachment process that happens. I could go on about this esoteric subject, but I'll save that for another episode down the line. I'm only explaining what I have perceived over the years based upon stories from people I've counseled, deathbeds where I've sat, and from the sessions in my practice. They are all around us, all the time. They don't leave. Once you develop a connection, it is always available to you. Our relationship with our loved one changes. It doesn't end. If you can reflect and try to understand this, it might help. As I've aged and understood more about my own spirituality, I've come to realize that the invisible world around us is always communicating with us. There are obvious signs, and then there are extremely subtle signs, but no relationship ever ends. Once you have a connection with something or someone, it doesn't just disappear because they do. It evolves. As with everything in our lives, relationships continue. Think about this. If you and your spouse had a contentious relationship when she died, you aren't going to continue to harbor those feelings for the rest of your life, no matter how much you might try. You'll likely experience some confusion because you might be sad about the nature of the relationship or the time spent in anger with one another. Eventually, you might begin to feel her release from her own life. After all, death is a release and transition into another state of being. You might begin to feel her forgiveness. You might develop a relationship with another person that gives you a perspective on your relationship with your deceased spouse. After some time, you might even begin to miss and love aspects you forgot about her. I can't know this for certain, but I do believe that they are beside us. I've seen and validated information from deceased relatives who visited clients in sessions at my office too many times to dismiss it. And there's one thing I do know. They want us to understand our own lives and to continue to live and experience life. I've never come across a deceased anyone or anything that didn't ask for understanding or desire acceptance of some sort. Grief teaches even the most doubtful cynic about spirituality. In my professional experience, I've seen angry cynics awaken to the invisible world when they break. Sometimes shattering into nothing is what thrusts us into unbelievable landscapes of life. After your world shatters and you're left naked and face down in a puddle on cold concrete, you have an opportunity. After everything I've just said, yes, I just said opportunity. I'm not diminishing the wretched and prolonged experience of grief. Here's the paradox. It happens all at once. So you're in gut-wrenching pain day after day, barely able to get out of bed, and at the same time, you're going to rebuild your life exactly the way you want it. Your world shatters into a million pieces. This is a time to look around and decide what pieces you want and what you don't want. You are rebuilding a life. You can make it look however you wish. This is the beauty of breaking. 3 takeaways I'd like you to remember. Number 1, grief is normal. Number 2, you are changed and you will never be the same. And number 3, you have an opportunity to rebuild your life exactly the way you want it. This is Kate Foley. Thank you for listening.